The heavy steel doors of the Vatican Bank's subterranean archive clicked open at exactly 3 in the morning. Inside, a team of independent forensic auditors, escorted by the Swiss Guard, stood before a digital ledger that had been systematically hidden from the world for over half a century. They had just discovered a ghost account holding over $1 billion. By dawn, Pope Leo XIV would execute a total unilateral seizure of those funds, freezing out some of the most powerful financial elites in Europe. And despite their unimaginable wealth and influence, not a single one of them could do a thing to stop it. Before we continue with this shocking story, if you're new here, please click the subscribe button, hit the like, and comment where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps us bring you more content like this every single week. Now, let's get back to what happened inside the hidden vaults of the Vatican. The dominoes began to fall on the night of October 14th, 2026. It did not start with a grand public announcement, but with a quiet, blinking red light on an isolated, secure server. Deep inside the newly restructured Supervisory and Financial Information Authority, an automated protocol had been triggered. Pope Leo XIV, formerly Robert Francis Post of Chicago, had secretly authorized the installation of a revolutionary tracking software designed to monitor the absolute most obscure layers of the Institute for the Works of Religion, commonly known as the Vatican Bank. For decades, the Vatican Bank had been a labyrinth of shadows, a place where the global elite parked untraceable wealth under the guise of pious charitable trusts. Previous pontiffs had tried to clean it up, closing thousands of suspicious accounts, but the deepest roots of the financial rot had always survived. They survived because the true power brokers didn't use standard accounts. They used level zero ledgers, ghost entities completely invisible to standard curial audits protected by ironclad legacy codes. But Leo XIV's new tracking software wasn't looking for standard accounts. It was looking for digital anomalies and microscopic data leaks. At 11:42 p.m., the system caught a massive automated data migration attempting to quietly bypass the main firewall. A mid-level technician named Marco Valli, who had been handpicked by the Pope's inner circle for his absolute loyalty and technical brilliance, traced the ping. It led to a dormant shell corporation registered in Geneva, cryptically named the Magdalene Trust. Valli's hands shook as he bypassed the final encryption wall and decrypted the primary balance. It read $1.24 billion. This wasn't church money meant for the poor. This was a dark money pool, an untaxed private reserve used by a syndicate of European banking elites, facilitated and shielded by deeply entrenched Vatican insiders. Valli knew that merely looking at this ledger could end his career. Or worse, he didn't call his immediate supervisor. He didn't call the Cardinal Secretary of State. Instead, following a secret protocol established just weeks prior, he picked up a red encrypted phone and dialed a number that bypassed every switchboard in Rome, ringing directly on the bedside table of Pope Leo XIV. The secure line buzzed in the dead of night, a sharp, dissonant sound against the silence of the apostolic palace. Pope Leo XIV did not fumble for the receiver. He had been sitting in his armchair, a copy of the Rule of St. Augustine in his lap, waiting for this very call. He listened to Valli's breathless, frantic explanation. The sheer scale of the Magdalene Trust, the bypass codes, the sheer audacity of the shadow account. When Valli finished, the Pope did not speak for a long moment. He didn't ask for clarification or express shock. He simply said, "Secure the server, Marco. Do not let the data sleep. Do not let it be wiped. And do not let anyone know you have touched it. I am coming." Leo rose with a fluidity that betrayed his years as a man of action. He did not call the Secretary of State. He knew that if the leak reached the upper echelons of the Curia, the Magdalene Trust would vanish into the dark web of international finance before the sun could rise. Instead, he made 2 calls. The first was to the commander of the Vatican Genie, a man of iron integrity who had served under the radar. The second was to Sister Alessandra Smerilli, the prefect who had spent years fighting the institutional inertia of Vatican finances. Within 40 minutes, the 3 of them stood in a cramped, windowless server room located 3 levels beneath the main library. The air hummed with the sound of cooling fans. Valli was huddled over a terminal, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of lines of code. And when the Pope entered, he didn't demand an explanation. He demanded control. "Show me the origin," Leo commanded. As Valli pointed to the screen, the truth became undeniable. The Magdalene Trust was not a random anomaly. It was the central nervous system for a syndicate of private banking cartels that had been laundering money through the Vatican for over 40 years. They weren't just storing wealth. They were leveraging it to manipulate interest rates and fuel private equity deals across Europe, using the Vatican's sovereign immunity as a legal shield. "If we move against this," the Gendarmerie commander whispered, the weight of the moment pressing on his chest, "we are not just seizing an account, we are declaring war on the most powerful financial entities on the continent. They have lobbyists, media empires, and political puppets in every capital from Brussels to Washington. If we take this money, they will come for you, Holy Father. They will dismantle every reform you have put in place. Leo XIV walked to the screen, staring at the figure. 1.2, sir. 24 billion, as if it were a physical weight he could lift. They have been using the church's name to buy influence for decades, the Pope said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register. They assumed we were too weak, too divided, or too complicit to ever look at the books. They were wrong. Commander, I want the server isolated from the external internet immediately. Seal the building. No one enters. And absolutely no one leaves until I authorize it. The data stream on the monitor began to shift from steady rhythmic pulses into a chaotic, jagged red wave that pulsed with frantic urgency. Valley looked up, his face drained of all color, his fingers hovering momentarily above the mechanical keyboard. They know, Holy Father, he whispered, his voice trembling under the immense pressure of the situation. They've detected the firewall breach. Someone from the outside, likely a high-level administrator within the syndicate, is initiating a remote override sequence to purge the account. In the deepest, darkest corners of the Vatican Bank, the Magdalene Trust was not merely sitting idle like a standard savings account. It was hardwired into a sophisticated, multi-layered, automated defense system designed to trigger a scorched earth wipe and transfer protocol if the account was ever accessed by an unauthorized entity. It was effectively a financial self-destruct mechanism designed to vanish into thin air at the first sign of interference. How long? Leo asked, his gaze fixed on the screen, his posture remaining completely calm, contrasting sharply with the panic visibly rising in the small, cramped server room. 3 minutes before the assets are dispersed into 1,000. Untraceable cryptocurrency wallets across the globe, Valley responded, his eyes wide as he watched the transfer percentage climb. It's a scorched earth protocol. They're burning the ledger in real time. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. This was the moment the global banking elite expected the Vatican to blink. They expected the Pope to panic, to hesitate, to worry about the catastrophic diplomatic fallout of seizing funds linked to major European powers. They were playing a calculated game of chicken, betting their fortunes on the assumption that the sovereign of the Vatican State would choose the comfort of the status quo over a direct, explosive confrontation with the moneyed interests of the world. Sister Smearley stepped forward, her eyes rapidly scanning the complex data trails, her sharp mind already mapping the network's vulnerabilities. Holy Father, she said, her voice steady despite the tension. If those funds vanish, we lose the evidence. We lose the trail that connects them to the high-ranking Curia officials who facilitated this for decades. We need to freeze the node, not just the account. Leo did not look at her. He remained motionless, his eyes locked on the figures flickering on the screen. He turned slowly to the Jean-Marie commander, who stood as a silent, hulking shadow by the heavy steel door. Is the building fully secured? The Pope demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Yes, Holy Father. The perimeter is locked down. We have jammed the signal and no cellular transmissions are getting in or out. The building is a digital fortress. Good, Leo said. He stepped forward and leaned over shoulder, his finger pointing to a specific cluster of subnodes labeled Alpha Prime. They aren't just wiping the account. They're using the bank's own internal infrastructure to route the transfer, hiding the exit point in plain sight. Valley, do not try to stop the wipe. If you try to block the transfer, you trigger the final purge. Instead, reroute the transfer. Redirect the entire 1.24 billion into a new single-key trust. A trust that only I can authorize. Can you do it? Valley hesitated for a split second, the sheer magnitude of the directive hitting him. He wasn't just a technician anymore. He was the primary actor in an unprecedented financial coup d'etat. He took a deep, steadying breath, his focus narrowing until the entire world outside this server room ceased to exist. I can do it, he murmured. But the encryption signature will be traced back to this terminal. They will know exactly who took the money. Let them trace it, the Pope replied, a faint, resolute smile touching his lips. I am the sovereign. Let them see who holds the keys now. The screen flickered, casting a sickly pale light across Valley's face as he navigated the complex nested directory of the Magdalene Trust. He wasn't just dealing with a simple bank account. He was navigating a sophisticated, self-encrypting network designed to ghost any attempt at infiltration. Every time he tried to pin down the primary server's physical location, the software would shunt the signal across a dozen proxy nodes in tax havens from the Cayman Islands to Vanuatu. It was a digital shell game, and the syndicate was betting that Leo would run out of time before he could find the master key. Outside the server room, the Vatican was in a state of quiet, high-stakes lockdown. Commander Rosie had effectively neutralized the palace's external communications. Any official who attempted to make a phone call from within the apostolic palace was met with a standard technical error message. The silence in the hallways was deafening, a stark contrast to the digital war being fought in the dark beneath the library. Sister Smerilli watched the countdown clock on the terminal. 1:45 remaining. She had been cross-referencing the transaction logs Valley had managed to scrape before the firewall tightened. "Holy Father," she said, her voice tight with realization. "These aren't just private investments. These are political payoffs. These transfers align perfectly with elections in 3 different countries over the last decade. They aren't just banking elites. They are kingmakers. They've been using the church's reputation as a laundry machine for global instability." Leo XIV stood motionless, his expression an unreadable mask. He had come to Rome to serve, not to rule, but he had quickly learned that the church had become a host to a parasite that threatened to hollow it out from within. They believed that by making the church dependent on their capital, they had bought our silence, the Pope said, his voice hard as flint. They forgot that the church was built to weather empires, not to be a vault for them. Valley's fingers danced across the mechanical keys, his brows slick with sweat. He was attempting to inject a loop back command into the trust's primary node, a dangerous move that could either lock the funds or trigger the total wipe. If the syndicate's defensive AI detected the command, the 1.24 billion euros would be shattered into thousands of tiny, untraceable fragments within seconds, gone forever. "I'm in the final layer of the handshake protocol," Valley shouted, his voice cracking. "They're trying to force the logout. They know someone is inside the system. Hold the line," the commander ordered, moving to Standover's shoulder. "I need more time," Valley gasped. "The encryption is rotating every 10 seconds. I can't." "You can," the Pope intervened, his presence suddenly filling the cramped humming room with an unshakable, quiet authority. He placed a hand firmly on Val's shoulder. "Do not fight the rotation. Anticipate it. Look for the pattern, Marco. They are arrogant. They think they are untouchable. They are using the same legacy algorithm they've used since the 9s. Find the predictable sequence." Valley blinked, his vision blurring. Then he saw it. A subtle repeating flaw in the code's rhythm. A heartbeat in the machine. He slammed the enter key, bypassing the new authorization code. The screen went black. For 3 agonizing seconds, the room was held in a vacuum of absolute silence. Then, a single line of green text appeared. Access granted. Master key acquired. The screen stopped flickering. The red waves of the attack vanished, replaced by a singular, steady stream of data flowing into a private, encrypted digital vault. Marco Valley slumped back in his chair, his skin pale, his hands still shaking. He had done it. He had hijacked the Magdalene Trust, rerouting the 1.24 billion into a blind account accessible only by the Pope's personal, biometric signature. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization of what had just occurred outside the vault in the boardrooms of Geneva, Frankfurt, and London. The panic was likely beginning to spread like a wildfire. The syndicates wouldn't just be angry, they would be terrified. That money was their leverage, their shadow capital that kept their puppet politicians in line and their influence over global markets. Absolute. By seizing it, Pope Leo XIV hadn't just committed a financial crime, he had effectively declared war on the shadow architects of the modern financial order. "They'll be knocking on our doors within the hour," Commander Rossi said. His eyes scanning the security monitors that showed the Vatican's perimeter remained suspiciously quiet. "Not with search warrants, Holy Father, with lawyers, lobbyists, and perhaps eventually something much more direct. You have just frozen their blood supply." Leo. Our 14th straightened his cassock, his face betraying no sign of hesitation. "Let them come. For centuries they have operated under the cover of darkness. Assuming the church was a fortress of tradition they could manipulate for their own gain, they didn't account for the fact that a fortress can also be a prison." The Pope turned to Sister Smerilli. "Alessandra, prepare the press office, not for denial, but for a disclosure. If they want to play this game in the light, we will give them the brightest stage in history. We don't just hold the money. We hold the proof of every transaction, every bribe, and every compromised official connected to the Magdalene Trust." But as the Pope spoke, Valley gasped. He had been monitoring the network traffic, looking for signs of the syndicate's counterstrike. "Holy Father," he whispered, pointing at the screen. "They aren't just trying to hack back into the server. They are initiating a total blackout. They're cutting off the Vatican's connection to the global banking system. They are isolating the entire city-state. The implications were immediate. No transfers, no communications, no way to verify the seized assets. They were being locked inside their own house. The siege had begun." The lights in the apostolic palace flickered and dimmed, then hummed back to life. But the damage was done. The digital siege was not just a metaphorical threat, it was a physical strangulation. Within minutes of the master key being activated, the Vatican's external communications were severed. The internet connection to the outside world, the lifelines of global communication for the Holy See, was cut. It wasn't a technical glitch, it was a coordinated strike by the very financial syndicates whose secrets Leo had just locked away. Inside the server room, the screens remained pitch black, save for a single flashing cursor. Valley was frantic. "They've isolated us completely," he reported, his voice tight. "They aren't just locking us out, they're broadcasting a digital signal that is forcing a reboot of our entire internal grid. If they succeed, they'll wipe everything, the logs, the keys, the transaction trails. They're effectively scrubbing the crime scene from halfway across the world." Leo XIV stood in the center of the command room, his eyes scanning the faces of his team. "They want us to play by their rules," the Pope said, his voice calm, cutting through the rising panic. "They rely on the assumption that we are tethered to their systems, that we need their networks to exist. But they forgot something vital. We have been here for 2,000 years, long before their ledgers existed, and we will be here long after their algorithms fade into obscurity." The Pope turned to the commander of the Germ. "Commander, do we still have the physical copies of the transfer logs? The ones Valley printed before we isolated the terminal?" "Yes, Holy Father, they are secure." "Then we do not need their network to tell the truth," Leo declared. He walked to the door, his steps echoing in the suddenly silent palace. "If they have cut our digital voice, we will use the oldest method in history. We will bypass their blockade. Prepare the secret archive files. We are not just leaking this information to one journalist in Milan anymore. We are releasing it to the world simultaneously in every major language, through every channel that doesn't rely on their controlled grid. Print it, courier it, fax it, broadcast it via satellite. Do whatever is necessary. The blackout ends when the world sees what they have done." As Leo ascended the stairs, the atmosphere in the palace shifted from defensive panic to cold, calculated defiance. The banking elite were playing a high-stakes game of economic sabotage, unaware that they had just provoked a man who was no longer playing their game. The Pope had successfully pivoted the battlefield. The conflict was no longer about digital access. It was about the truth, and the truth, unlike the Magdalene Trust, could not be erased by a remote override sequence. The shock in the boardrooms of Zurich was absolute. When the lead administrator of the Magdalene Trust attempted to initiate the final transfer of the $1.24 billion, he was met with a denial of access error that sent a chill through the entire consortium. The money wasn't just blocked. It had been moved to a vault they could not touch. Panic, cold and sharp, replaced the hubris of the banking elite. They had spent decades building a fail-safe infrastructure, a shadow system that existed in the cracks of global finance, and a simple priest from Chicago had not only found the cracks, but had effectively locked them out of the entire building. Within an hour of the master key activation, the narrative began to shift globally. It started with a whisper in the financial press, a coordinated leak designed to discredit the Holy Father before he could go public. Major news outlets, long influenced by the syndicate's deep pockets, began pushing a unified story. Pope Leo XIV had suffered a sudden severe medical emergency. The reports claimed he was incapacitated, suffering from a cognitive decline that made him unable to govern. It was a classic smear campaign, a surgical strike to delegitimize any future claims or accusations the Pope might make. If the world thought he was senile, they would not believe a word he said. Inside the Vatican, the reality of the blackout became clearer. The Gennari confirmed that not only were internet cables severed, but their satellite uplinks had been jammed by a powerful localized signal originating from nearby Italian communications hubs. The Vatican city-state was digitally blind and deaf. The Swiss Guard, usually accustomed to ceremonial duties, had shifted into a defensive formation. They were no longer guarding art. They were guarding a leader under siege. Leo XIV stood by the window of his private study, watching the familiar lights of Rome flickering in the distance. He knew the playbook. They would claim he was ill, then they would claim he had abdicated, and finally they would push for an emergency conclave to replace him with someone far more malleable. He was being made a prisoner in his own home, isolated from the faithful he was sworn to protect. "They are coming for the narrative, Holy Father," Sister Smearley said, stepping into the room. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red from hours of work. But her resolve was unbroken. "The major news agencies are all repeating the same script about your health. If we don't break this silence, the world will accept their version of the truth by tomorrow morning." Leo turned away from the window, his expression cold and focused. "They think they can bury the truth under a mountain of lies. They forget that the truth has a momentum of its own." He gestured to the heavy wooden desk, which was now piled high with physical folders, the tangible printed evidence of the syndicate's decades of corruption. "Commander, I want our most trusted couriers ready. We are not just releasing this information to the press, we are releasing it to the people. If the digital world is closed to us, then the physical world will carry our voice. Every bishop, every local parish, every independent archive, we will distribute these files manually. By dawn, every major disease or buy will have the truth in their hands. They can cut the cables, but they cannot cut the conscience of the church. The siege had entered its most dangerous phase. The Pope was no longer just the head of the Catholic Church. He had become a dissident in the eyes of the global financial elite, and he was ready to burn the bridges they had spent a century building. The silence within the apostolic palace was absolute, a void of digital communication. But outside, the world was on the brink of an unprecedented awakening. Leo XIV knew that the syndicate's power relied entirely on the illusion of control. By blinding the Vatican, they had hoped to manufacture a reality where the Pope was sick, incompetent, or dead. They failed to understand the nature of the institution they sought to parasitize. For 2,000 years, the Church had survived through its physical human network. When the satellites went dark, the couriers, men and women who had moved secrets through the rise and fall of empires, sprang into action. In a secret basement across Rome, ancient printing presses, long relegated to historical interest, began to churn. Simultaneously, encrypted physical drives were handy, delivered by a network of dedicated clergy to major media hubs in London, New York, and Tokyo. The syndicate's digital blockade was formidable, but it was essentially a wall built on quicksand. It stopped emails, but it couldn't stop human beings. The syndicate leaders huddled in a secure bunker in Zurich, watched their monitors, expecting the Pope to remain silent, isolated, and broken. Instead, they watched as the first report started to bypass their filters. It began as a trickle, a breaking news alert on a minor independent news site in Japan, then a live feed in Argentina. The data, the irrefutable digital signatures of the Magdalene Trust, began to circulate. It wasn't a hack, it was a revelation. Every bribe, every shadow account, and every politician bought by the banking elite was being laid bare, translated, and verified. The syndicate leaders saw the logs appear on global news feeds. They hadn't just lost the money, they had lost the story. The truth was out. And in the digital age, a truth that big could not be unread. Pope Leo XIV, confined behind the walls of his palace, had just shattered the world's most powerful financial conspiracy without firing a single shot, only by letting the light in. The dawn of October 15th did not bring the silence the syndicate had hoped for. It brought a roar that would echo for generations across the globe, from the newsrooms of New York to the independent press agencies in Singapore and the diocesan offices in Manila. The packages arrived. They weren't digital files. They were physical, verified, and impossible to ignore. Because the Pope's network had bypassed the digital blackout. There was no firewall to hack, no server to crash, and no remote wipe command that could reach these physical pages. By 8 a.m., the syndicate's attempt to paint the Pope as incapacitated had completely unraveled. Major global news outlets, unable to ignore the overwhelming influx of verified evidence, began printing headlines that sent the financial markets into a tailspin. The names of the banking elite, the shadowy shell corporations, and the complicit political figures were no longer rumors. They were now public record. In the financial districts of London and Zurich, the reaction was frantic. High-ranking board members who had built their reputations on the bedrock of discreet influence suddenly found themselves exposed, their faces plastered on the front pages of every major newspaper. They had tried to isolate the Vatican, but in doing so, they had isolated themselves from the world. The Pope's strategy had worked with devastating precision. By using the oldest, most reliable network in history, the Church's own human infrastructure, he had turned the tide. He had proven that while the syndicate controlled the wires, the Church controlled the trust. At midday, Pope Leo XIV finally appeared on the balcony of the Apostolic Palace. He was not the ailing, confused man the syndicate had portrayed. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on the thousands gathered below in St. Peter's Square. There was no teleprompter, no rehearsed political speech. He spoke of the Magdalene Trust not as a victory, but as a cleansing. A house built on the foundation of stolen bread will always crumble. The Pope declared, his voice carrying over the square, "We have seen the ledger, we have seen the names, but more importantly, we have seen the cost of their greed, the suffering of the vulnerable, and the corruption of our purpose. The Church is not a bank for the wicked. It is a sanctuary for the suffering." The crowd erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was the sound of a paradigm shifting. The syndicate, which had functioned in the shadows for nearly half a century, was now exposed to the blinding light of public scrutiny. Their leverage had been stripped away, and for the first time, the banking elite realized they were not fighting a weak old man in a palace. They were fighting an institution that had finally decided to remember exactly what it was. The siege had been lifted not by force, but by the weight of truth. The dawn that followed the truth offensive did not bring a simple sunrise. It brought the end of an era. By the time that our bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang for the midday Angelus, the global financial landscape had been irrevocably altered. The syndicate, which had operated from the shadows for decades, pulling the strings of international markets, was now facing a total public collapse. The 24 billion euros. Once the silent leverage of the banking elite was now under the guardianship of an independent global commission earmarked for humanitarian restitution across Europe, arrest warrants were being issued with unprecedented speed. Financial regulators, suddenly emboldened by the sheer weight of the evidence provided by the Vatican, moved in on the shell corporations that had protected the syndicate's wealth. It wasn't just a financial blow, it was a total dismantling of their influence. The elite, who had once assumed they could control the narrative through media suppression and economic threats, found themselves isolated and exposed. The public outcry was not against the Vatican, but against the institutions that had sought to corrupt it. Inside the apostolic palace, the atmosphere had shifted from the suffocating tension of a siege to the steady, calm rhythm of a house restored. Pope Leo XIV remained at his desk, the same simple wooden workspace where he had first confronted corruption. He hadn't sought this battle, but he had fought it with a conviction that caught the world off guard. He had proven that the Church, when stripped of its worldly attachments and secrets, possessed a power that no financial empire could match, the power of undeniable truth. The Magdalene Trust had become more than just a seized account. It became a symbol. It was a reminder that even the most powerful institutions on earth can be held to account. The Vatican had emerged from the fire, not just unscathed, but renewed. The era of internal handling and quiet settlements was truly over. As the sun set over Rome, Leo walked to the window, looking out over the square, where thousands still gathered in quiet prayer. He knew that the world would continue to challenge the Church, and that new shadows would always seek to creep into the halls of power. But for this moment, the fortress was clean. He had not used the money to buy influence, nor to expand his own power. He had used it to force a reckoning with the systems of greed that had long plagued the modern world. His final act on that long, transformative day was a simple one. He signed a new set of transparency statutes, mandating that every single cent entering or leaving the Vatican would henceforth be subject to public independent audit. It was a closure to the crisis, but more than that, it was a beginning. The Church, under Leo XIV, had reclaimed its voice. It had decided that its greatest treasure was not in its vaults, but in its integrity. And in the face of that, the power of the elite had simply ceased to exist. This was the story of a pope who chose to serve the truth above all else, and in doing so, changed the course of history. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it. Your support helps keep these narratives of truth and courage alive. Let us know in the comments. Do you believe transparency is the most important value for institutions today?